Hi everyone. Welcome back to CMN 201. This is our class for Thursday, the 14th of September, where I wanted to introduce the idea of media and popular culture and how that could be related to horror film, which is the topic of this semester. You'll remember that last class I had reviewed the syllabus and the course outline, and I hope it was self-explanatory, but if you have any questions, please reach out to me. One of the things that I didn't talk about last class that I want to talk about now is a section about plagiarism. Last class, you might have also noticed that I'm not using the online grading system. So there's enough of the dinosaur in me that still uses a combination of paper and also online. So certainly I'll be returning your work to you and you will have your grades. But if you ever wanted to reach out and know what your grade is, just feel free to do so, and I'll be happy to give you an update. And in fact, we'll talk a little bit about some of the upcoming assignments, specifically journals, in today's class as well. So, in terms of plagiarism, it used to be a fairly easy conversation. And what I would do, and I still do this, is that there's a section on the syllabus entitled Plagiarism. I tried very hard not to plagiarize in that section about plagiarism. So you can see that I have indicated where I got my source from, which is how you avoid plagiarism as long as you give credit to either the person or the entity that either had that idea or created that language, then you're no longer plagiarizing. So plagiarism is using somebody else's language or ideas without acknowledging the source. And it's comparable to theft, but rather than property, which you would be stealing, would be what we call intellectual property. So rather than physical property, if you were going to a retail store, for instance, and shoplift, you're taking somebody's ideas or language. And the consequences can be just as severe if you are engaged in theft of intellectual property. If you were to get off easy, so to speak, you would fail that assignment. If you were not to get off easy, so to speak, well, you would be expelled from the college with a notation written on your transcript that you plagiarized. And then I would give two stories to encourage my students not to plagiarize. One occurred to me in the early days of my career, very early, in fact, pre-internet. So the reason why I mention this is because I was not able to use electronic resources to try to figure out if someone was plagiarizing. And as I'm sure you're aware of, as many electronic resources that exist to help students plagiarize, an equal number exists to help teachers figure out if students are plagiarizing. So one of my favorite being Turnitin.com, where I could type in a sentence or I could type in a paragraph and do an electronic search. But I couldn't do that because it didn't exist yet. So I'm reading a paper from one of my classes, and it's familiar to me, which I guess isn't that terribly surprising because teachers are well read, but it didn't take me long to figure out why this was familiar to me, and it wasn't because I was particularly well read. This was a passage that was actually taken from our class textbook. And I'm fond of saying, you can't make these things up, and you certainly couldn't hear that somebody actually copied a passage from the textbook with a few mechanical errors. I don't know if it was because they were a sloppy plagiarist or because they were hopeful that if there were a few errors, I would be misled. But that's my personal story. The better story did not occur to me, but it happened around the same time period, pre-internet. And it happened to a middle-aged professor. That part is important, middle-aged. So what happened? He's reading a series of papers and realizes that something sounds familiar. Again, he couldn't go to the internet. It hadn't existed in the way we think of it today. And he's wondering, where have I read this before? And then it occurs to him, he hadn't read it before. He had written it a couple of decades earlier. It was one of his old college papers when he was a college student. And I know the likelihood, 1 in a million. The reality was that as unlikely as it could be, it actually did happen. And it had something to do with a fraternity that was recycling old papers from former fraternity members. But nevertheless, not only was this student caught plagiarizing, but this student actually was plastered all over the academic newspapers. Yes, there is such a thing as academic newspapers. So I would tell these two stories to encourage students not to plagiarize. And then I would talk about how our journals are informal writing assignments. I really want to think about, or I really want to see what your thinking is. And then if you hand in your final project early enough, you can rewrite it for a higher grade. And your final exam is open book, open notes. So it isn't a memory test. It's an understanding test. Try to encourage you not to plagiarize. But everything's changed in the last 6 months or so with artificial intelligence. So the game is completely different. And I encourage you not to use artificial intelligence in this class for a multitude of reasons that I'm going to share with you. So I'm going to get on my soapbox right now and talk a little bit about artificial intelligence. I personally have grave concerns at the speed at which this is moving. We are having changes occur that usually take place over years, happen in weeks. And we don't necessarily know what the consequences of this is. And I think about movies like The Terminator, if you've ever seen The Terminator, but this is an old story. It goes all the way back to Frankenstein, where you've got a scientist or some sort of an organization that's put together a new invention or some sort of technological advancement without considering the consequences. And it turns out that the consequences are dire, and they're not able to control the consequences. And I'm not sure what this does or doesn't mean with artificial intelligence, but I think about the speed where it's increasing almost exponentially. And I worry about the consequences on our society from a sociological and an economic perspective, where entire industries could basically be wiped out because of artificial intelligence. And if you've been following the Hollywood strike that's been going on, the actors' strike, this is a huge point of contention that artificial intelligence could replace a whole host of workers, writers, musicians, people who are responsible for things like lighting, and also the actors themselves, believe it or not, because artificial intelligence has gotten to the point where it can utilize the images of actors from the past and make new content. So you don't need actors. You don't need writers. You don't need artists. I find this to be quite troubling. Again, I don't know where we're going to head with this. But there are other issues with artificial intelligence. I've done a good amount of reading and about the propensity of artificial intelligence to do something that has been called hallucinate. Perhaps you know it better as lying, but lying implies conscious will, which is a whole other issue with artificial intelligence, a whole can of worms that I'm not even going to get into. But artificial intelligence has been giving wrong information, and not necessarily because there's a glitch in the programming or in the algorithm. And if you look at the notes below, and I'll always share my notes with you below each of the videos. These are literally the teaching notes that I use to give class. I have them in paper form. You have them in electronic. You'll see that I have given you the link for an article, for a story I'm going to share with you that you might have already read about, but if you're curious to know more about it, you could click on the link. It was about an attorney. He used artificial intelligence to put together a legal brief. And in fact, he point blank asked the artificial intelligence, are these court cases that I'm citing legitimate and valid? And he was reassured by the artificial intelligence, yes, they are. In fact, the artificial intelligence even cited the journals in which these court cases were cited in. So the lawyer presents his brief, and it turns out that there was investigation into the brief. None of these court cases existed. The artificial intelligence hallucinated? Lied? I don't know what language you want to use, but it gave incorrect information. Let's just say that a lawyer with decades worth of work is now facing some rather severe sanctions and consequences, with no good excuse outside of that this attorney wanted to save some time and effort. So instead of doing the original research himself, this attorney used artificial intelligence. This is highly problematic if you're using artificial intelligence for gathering information and presenting information. Artificial intelligence learns from us, what we input into it and what we ask. I also find that very troubling that artificial intelligence could be using my input in order to grow exponentially to a point where it's no longer controllable. So these are just some of the few reasons why I encourage you to avoid artificial intelligence in this class, especially if you're in class to learn. And my assumption is that you are. That the learning that goes on happens through exercising your brain, not through necessarily using a device outside of your brain. So that's my soapbox. I'll get off my soapbox now. I'm cognizant of the time. We're 10 minutes into the class, and I haven't had a chance to talk about the readings that I had assigned. Very hopefully, because I'm well aware that students are still adding and dropping classes or perhaps still getting textbooks. But what I had wanted, what I had hoped, and what I expect as the semester progresses is that you can do these readings prior to the class videos, because this is what I'm going to be talking about in the class videos. And today's readings were the introduction from Projected Fears, as well as the readings from the book Horror Film, What is Horror? That's the 4th chapter. Why of Horror, the 5th chapter, and Critics and Censors, chapter 6. So this is basically introduction to get us prepared for actually watching the films themselves, which begin next week. However, one of our texts, entitled Nightmares in Red, White, and Blue, has an accompanying documentary. It is approximately, or actually I can tell you more than approximately, I can tell you exactly how long this documentary is. It is 1 hour and 36 minutes. So part of what I'm going to ask you in today's class is to watch that documentary, because it'll give you a good overview of the topics that we're going to be talking about over the course of the semester. So let me briefly talk about the readings that I had assigned today, and then let me briefly talk about some of the assignments that are coming up, just so that I can leave you to watch the documentary. So in terms of Projected Fears and the introduction, it gives some definitions. It talks about culture. In the broadest sense of the word, culture is any group membership. I guess we could debate whether or not a pair is a group, but certainly 3 or more is a group. And there's a certain predictive element to all groups. All groups form kind of personalities, in effect. There is a way for you to predict, not necessarily everyone's actions, but at least some people's actions within the group, their behaviors. But not just their behaviors, actions are usually fairly easy to identify because they are observable. But things like beliefs, things that the group sees as true or false, or things like attitudes, feelings, or emotional responses, even values, which can be very highly embedded and very difficult to change. And again, we don't want to stereotype and assume that everybody is the same in a group, though I can assume that our group, for better or for worse, our class is a cultural group, values education, or else why, or for the most part, most of the members of this group do, because why would you be spending the time and money getting educated if you didn't value it? When we talk about popular culture, we're talking about culture that's shared by the masses, large groups of people, mainstream. And we're specifically, when we talk about culture in this class, talking about the culture of the United States. Though there are lots of other cultural groups that we could think about within the United States, but also outside of the United States. And when we talk about what's wide or mainstream, something that has appealed to the masses and has stood the test of time, it's usually viewed as somehow lowbrow, or oftentimes viewed as somehow lowbrow. Something that doesn't have the cachet, for instance, of something that could be viewed as more intellectual. So Shakespeare is considered to be, very intellectually stimulating. But something like a horror film might be seen as not intellectually stimulating. I think they can both be intellectually stimulating, just in different ways. And as we'll talk about, Shakespeare dealt with issues of horror. When you think about Macbeth, and when you think about, Hamlet. He oftentimes talked about supernatural elements, which we'll talk about also as well. When we view these films over the course of a semester, we're going to view them more than just for profit or entertainment, which is usually how they're consumed. There's nothing wrong with profit. There's nothing wrong with entertainment. Shakespeare himself wanted to entertain and derive profit. But there probably is something more going on. There probably is some sort of statement that's being made, which is what I'm going to argue when we watch all of these films. That these films are more than just something that can be read literally. They can be read, and notice the language I use, to read, to interpret. They can be read from an allegorical perspective, from a symbolic perspective. In other words, they're representational. They're abstract. And we use symbols all the time in our society, usually physical objects to represent something like a feeling that isn't necessarily concrete. So patriotism isn't something that's necessarily concrete, but it can be represented through something like a flag, a symbol, in effect. And sometimes the symbols are obvious, and they're part of our cultural collective, and sometimes they're less obvious, and we need to do a little bit of interpretation. We see this in literature, and we will also see this in film, good film. And I would argue that the films that we're watching, in this instance, these horror films, reflect our collective fears, the anxieties of a generation, which is what the texts have also been arguing as well. That horror film and also horror literature tends to be cyclical. It oftentimes is generational because each generation has a new fear. Also, if you're familiar with Stephen King, you know that he is a great author that oftentimes has had his writings made into films, horror films. And horror films tend to be particularly interesting to adolescents. That tends to be one of the largest audiences to consume horror films. Stephen King argues this because adolescents like to play with the idea of the deviant. They like to push boundaries as they are moving from childhood into adulthood. And I think there's a certain level of truth to that. But many non-adolescents also embrace horror film, and I think it is because it reflects the fears and the anxieties of the time. Certainly this is how I've put together our class, that each decade can have a representative film talking about the particular anxieties of that decade. And in terms of genres, because this is a genre, it's a category or a type. You know, we could be talking about science fiction, or we could be talking about drama, or we could be talking about romance. In this instance, we're talking about horror film. It has predictable elements associated with it. And in some ways, again, that takes away some of the creativity. But it also has something unique about it that makes it interesting. And for horror film, we want to be surprised. We want to be shocked. So the trick is that how do you shock an audience who already is aware of the conventions? But it can be done. And going back to Shakespeare, he wrote in genres. He wrote comedies, and they followed certain criteria. He wrote histories. They follow certain criteria. He wrote tragedies. They follow certain criteria. And yet he could be creative and do new things within those criteria. So the next chapter is What is Horror? And that's from our horror film class. And that you'll see a lot of genre blending. And that horror oftentimes deals with science fiction and with fantasy. And vice versa. So, for instance, if you were going to think about Frankenstein, it's a very famous horror film and horror text, but it oftentimes is classified as science fiction. The idea behind horror is that it usually is associated with Gothic, which I'm going to be talking about fairly soon. There usually is a supernatural element or possibility of supernatural associated with it, as opposed to science fiction, which is not supernatural, something that defies natural laws. It's something that can be done through natural laws, just science hasn't arrived at it yet. And again, Frankenstein sort of straddles both in that particular instance. Or take fantasy. Something like Harry Potter is fantasy, and yet it also deals with the supernatural. So some of the elements that you will find in horror: monstrosity. In fact, Monstrosity comes from the Greek, or from the Latin word, I should say, monstrare, which means to show or reveal. And I'd say that these films and these texts, if you're reading the text from these films, they oftentimes are combined with one another, basically show or reveal something about ourselves and our times. Fear, anxiety, the threatening of normality or moral order. Of course, normality is subjective. We can debate what is normal and also what is abnormal. One of my favorite television shows is The Twilight Zone, the original Twilight Zone. There was a great episode called that Beauty is in the Eye of the Beholder, where a woman is undergoing plastic surgery. All we see is her bandaged face. We assume that she has some deformity, and the plastic surgery is an attempt to rectify that deformity. When the surgery is over and the bandages are removed, we see her face, and she gasps in horror. Except we as audience are confused because by any standard in our society, she's quite beautiful. And then the camera pans out to the doctors and nurses, who look like, at least by our standards, deformed monstrosities. Because beauty is indeed in the eye of the beholder. What is normal and abnormal is determined by the majority, which actually happens to be a quote by Richard Matheson in his text, I Am Legend, that normality is a majority concept. One of my favorite quotes, by the way. Having some sort of figure under threat. As I had indicated, at least the possibility of supernatural elements, that which defies natural order. But for those individuals who are skeptical of the supernatural, there also is a plausible or a natural explanation as well. Hence, there's ambiguity. So it could be supernatural, but it also could be natural. Atmosphere. Atmosphere is so important. Just think about how Halloween is coming up and how important the atmosphere of Halloween is. Doubling, this idea of twos. In fact, we even have a term for this. It's called doppelganger. And we'll definitely see the idea of twos in many of these horror films and just in horror texts and gothic texts. So to get to the question of why of horror, why is it that some people find this to be interesting and engaging when other people want to avoid it? Perhaps it's because of the release of endorphins, which can oftentimes bring feelings of pleasure. The same reason why some people ride the roller coaster, because it results in a kind of rush, in effect. But we know it's happening in a safe context because the roller coaster should be under control. It wouldn't be nearly as pleasurable if this were happening to our car, because then our car would be out of control. Though some people hate roller coasters, and it doesn't matter if it's safe or not. Just like some people hate horror films, and it doesn't matter if it's real or not. I always say you have to have the right temperament to take this class. You're not supposed to have nightmares because we're talking about horror films and watching them. If that's the case, then this may not be the class for you. But instead, I usually end up with enrollment of students who are telling me, bring it on, that this for me is fun. I know for me, personally, it's fun. Maybe it's because of catharsis, a Greek term, which means the purging of emotion. So if you know your Greek literature, you know Oedipus the King. It's a text I talk about in my classes, in Greek, my drama section, a Greek drama that is about the purging of emotion. That's where the term came from, actually, Oedipus the King. That we can experience the emotion in a safe way. In this instance, we can experience that anxiety in a safe way. Stephen King, going back to him, has a very famous text called Danse Macabre. You may not be aware of it because he's perhaps better known for his fiction. Danse Macabre is a text that I have my students read, at least in part, in my Gothic literature class. And it's a study of horror film and horror fiction. And one of the things that he says, because he's very well read in the subject, and in fact, he has a literary background, he has a degree in English, he's taught classes in this, that not only is it that perhaps we are interested in horror film and horror fiction because we want to engage in deviance and then ultimately return to a status quo where everything is put back to normality, but that our biggest fear is death, and that these stories, whether they be in film and text or both, help us deal with the great unknown, which is death. There are other scholars, people have actually done scholarship in this, about why it is we study horror film, and they've studied actual horror films the way we're going to. A very famous scholar is named Robin Wood, and he wrote something called An Introduction to Horror Film, very long essay, where he talks about that horror film examines that which is psychologically repressed, that which we consider other or different, and anything that's considered other or different is considered to be a threat. And in fact, we could perhaps explain things like the isms that you might have heard of before, racism, classism, sexism, through fear of other, that which is considered to be different or alien from oneself. Sigmund Freud. Now, you probably are familiar with that name with psychology. He came up with an essay called The Uncanny. And that essay talks about fear. And that specifically, fright brings back that which is repressed. And that which is repressed is the old and the familiar. That it's familiar, but it's also strange. So it's unfamiliar at the same time. And that's what leads to fear. So when you talk about something being uncanny, we oftentimes talk about how it's not supposed to be real, but it seems too real. This oftentimes happens with animation, so we feel uncomfortable by it. Another author and scholar, Julia Kristeva, talked a little bit about how oftentimes horror films are about bodily excretions, things like blood, and that this is about the self and other, that not only is it about the self and other, it's about the inside and the outside, that once you put something from the inside that's supposed to remain inside to the outside, again, something like blood, that inspires fear. Or Barbara Creed, that you probably have heard of, even though you may not know her name. She did a very famous work on female monstrosity, and someone else, Carol Clover, took off on that and talked about a very common phrase called the final girl. That the final girl, and you might know this from movies like Halloween, that this is the virginal and innocent girl who survives the horrors at the end, but not before being victimized and terrorized ahead of time. So this phallic survivor, because usually she's being pursued by male, is something that's become part of our vernacular when we talk about the final girl, as portrayed by Laurie Strode in Halloween. And this is a film that we will be watching. There are lots of other critics, so I could go on and on about critics. I just wanted to give you a handful just to let you know that there are people who've done some serious scholarship in this area. Moving on to critics and censors of horror film. Horror film is often maligned and misunderstood. It's oftentimes viewed as something that is lowbrow, something that's crass, vulgar, immoral, even violent, and that the audiences are too. I don't necessarily agree with that. I think it depends on the film. Stephen King, again, going back to Danse Macabre, he talks about the gross out, which is the lowest level of horror, that basically is supposed to gross you out. But that isn't the only kind of horror that exists. There's subtleties. When we talk about terror, or even just horror, there's a certain use of the imagination that's involved. And we'll see that in many of these films, they oftentimes rely on imagination and only imagination. Yet we do have films that also cross over into the gross out section. The Exorcist, a film that I've oftentimes has said has been misviewed, and it's based on a New York Times bestseller. A text that I have oftentimes said has been misread, and we'll talk about that when we get to The Exorcist. So, writing journals. As I had indicated, I wanted you to do some informal writing responses to each of the films that we are going to be seeing. So our first film is going to be next week, and it's going to be from 1920, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. It's considered to be the first horror film, or at least the first feature-length horror film. So next class, I have some readings assigned talking about The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. I'm also going to be talking about Dr. Caligari, and I'm going to be asking you to watch The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. As I indicated, whenever I can find free links for these films, I will share them with you. But because of copyright, I may not always be able to find free links, and if that's the case, you may need to stream the film through a streaming service. You may need to rent it or purchase it, or at least watch it on reserve in the GCC library. And as I was just telling my literature students earlier today, if we're going to watch film from an analytic perspective, or read literature from an analytic perspective, this requires multiple rereadings or multiple viewings. I suggest 3. The first for plot, what the heck is going on? The second for analysis, to try to interpret what that means. And the third to refresh your memory before you talk about the text or the film, or you write about it. Now, I'm well aware that you may not have the opportunity to watch a film 3 times. But certainly the more you watch a film, the greater you'll be able to understand it and to catch details about it. And this means that if you've already seen some of these films, that does not preclude you from watching them again. Each viewing is going to bring forth new meaning, especially now where you're watching these films more for, not just for entertainment, but more for analysis and academic interpretation. So what I wanted to do with each of the films was to allow you to respond informally to those films. And even though I'm an English teacher, I won't be grading for grammar or mechanics, just for content. And I'm evaluating these journals informally. You can think about them much like a diary, but rather than writing about your personal life, you're responding to the films that you're viewing. Your own personal reflections, but you can also incorporate elements from the readings that I've assigned and elements from our class videos and elements from our class discussions as well. And I'm thinking about a page or so for each film, but it can be as long or short as you'd like it to be. And I'm evaluating it informally on a checkmark system. A plus is excellent. A check plus is very good. A check is satisfactory. There also is a less than satisfactory and unsatisfactory. We'll be doing this for each of the films we'll be viewing this semester. Not for today's documentary. I see that as introductory. But starting with The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, which basically means at the ending of the semester, you will have 11 journals that you would have written, submitted into me. I would have responded and submitted back to you. I ask that you submit these journals via PDF to my email. This is how my grading program works best. My email is my surname, Ruiz, R-U-I-Z, @gcc.mass.edu. I'll put some commentary on them. Again, I'm not evaluating for grammar or mechanics, just for content. Get that back to you. These journals will probably be very helpful to you in your final examination, which is open book, open notes. It's an essay exam, but it's asking you to put together some of the major themes and concepts we've talked about all semester long. So you can think of the journals as your note-taking for these films. And yes, while you're watching films, it is a good idea to take notes, especially if you're watching these films from an academic perspective. And for some students, it's hard to take notes and watch at the same time, which might mean reviewing more than one viewing of each of the films. As you know, there also is a final project in this class. And it could turn out that you might want to devote one of your final projects to one of these films. And if that's the case, well, you've already done some writing and some thinking about it through your journal. You would just need to expand and develop. We'll talk a little bit more about the final project as the semester progresses. So in terms of our course outline, what you can see is that for each week I have a film. And what I've done, much like I've done with your class discussion form question, is that you have 48 hours to just submit in your response to the class form discussion question. That's your attendance for the class in effect. And you're not required to respond to your classmates, but you are required to read your classmates' responses and to also read my responses in turn. That would give you a good idea of what we would do during an introduction. And I can't remember if I started this video, I don't think I did, by telling you a little bit about myself, which is what you did in your class discussion form. For me, it begins in New York City, which is where I was born and raised. And I attended college in upstate New York, University of Rochester. And I always talk about the college catalogs for the University of Rochester that advertise the school as a place where students can experience real winters. And oh boy, did I experience a real winter. It was brutal. Romantic, perhaps, but brutal as well. There I am in college, majoring in English, minoring in psychology, because I'm absolutely certain I'm going to be a lawyer. So be careful if you're absolutely certain about something. You never know how things might change. I ended up taking a Shakespeare class, falling in love, and wanted to devote my time to literature. So I go to graduate school for literature in a warm climate. Didn't want real winters. It was in Southern California, UCLA. No winters. There were earthquakes. There were some mudslides, so forth and so on. Very expensive real estate, by the way, too, surrounding the campus. I'm majoring in Shakespeare and his contemporaries. I eventually finish and begin teaching and decide that I want to come home. And for me, home was anything on the East Coast. So I apply for positions, and Greenfield Community College asked me out for an interview. So this is how it all ends. And I'm very impressed, even with the name, Greenfield, because the community has fields that are green. And where I am in California, there's a drought. There are no green fields. I was offered the position. I accepted. And I was assured by the interview committee that once I moved from California to Massachusetts, winters here aren't that bad. And, well, I was to find out something a bit different, especially considering that I started in the 93-94 academic year, one of the most brutal winters that Massachusetts had ever experienced. It broke all kinds of records. But I've been here ever since. So again, I can't remember if I started this video by telling you this story. So if I did, I apologize for repeating myself. It's been a long day. But that's a little bit about myself in the event that I didn't start the video telling you about myself. But now that you've introduced yourself on the class discussion forum, today's question for the class discussion forum is going to be about that documentary, Nightmares in Red, White, and Blue, that I'm going to be asking you to watch. And the question is what did you think was one of the most interesting things in that documentary? Obviously, there's no right or wrong answer. I'm more interested in your thinking process than I am in your interpretation. And that would be due Saturday on the 16th. That would also be the time that your journal would be due for Dr. Caligari, since I'm going to be posting it on our next Thursday class. So you would have 48 hours to submit in a journal. Of course, if you need additional time, just ask me. I'll be happy to grant it to you. But my hope is that you'll be able to watch Dr. Caligari and my class video and be able to put together a journal at that point. And then we'll be doing that each week over the semester when we have a new film. So our next class is going to be the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, obviously, where you will be writing a journal response to it as well as answering a discussion form. For this week, you're just writing a discussion form. No journal due. We're still in our introduction. We'll also be talking about the origins of film Gothic, which is a chapter in Nightmares, and also genreification, which is a chapter in horror film, as well, of course, the film, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on next class with watching what's technically known as the first feature-length horror film. And I can't wait to see what you think is the most interesting in Nightmares in Red, White, and Blue. Take care. Bye-bye.